Hi, my name is JaclynFreidman. I don't always think about myself as a sex educator, even though I do some stuff that's like really straight up sex education, because I came to this as an anti-rape activist. Rape is not about sex. Now, that is true in a very specific way. Rape is not an act of sexual incontinence, right? Hopefully everyone in this room understands that. Rape is not about having an overwhelming desire for sex that one can't control. It's an act of power and violation, right? But it, I think, over the years got generalized in a way that made it difficult to talk about sex and rape in the same sentence. There are a lot of different sources that we have to shift the sexual culture if we're going to do something about sexual violence, right? That they're absolutely, completely, inextricably entwined, and we'll get into the whys and wherefores of that as we go. And so as I began to think about that and write about it, and then came to we put out, Jessica Valenti and I put out the call for my first book, Yes Means Yes, which is an anthology. We put a call for submissions out, and we got like nasty grams from anti-rape activists, a couple of them saying like, we have our eyes on you, right? Like that they were just very suspicious of our work, which is about talking about rape and sex in, as all part of the same ball of wax. And on the other, a flip side of that, there's sort of this movement called sex positivity. And I know what sex positivity is meant to mean, but I also know in practice that a lot of times the emphasis winds up on positivity in a way that actually leads a lot of people out. If we're going to talk about sex and want it to be positive for people, we also have to talk about all the ways in which it is sometimes very hurtful and damaging. And we have to actively work to change that. If we want sex to be positive for people, we have to actively work to change the way sex is used to harm. This is a quote from a kid who was a witness to the Steubenville rape. This was a bystander. He wasn't one of the perpetrators. He was a bystander. In the trial, they said, "Why didn't you intervene?" And he said, basically, "I didn't know what I was looking at was rape. I didn't know that's what rape looked like." Why? Well, because he was watching a young woman, lay passively and be acted upon by two guys. Our dominant cultural narrative is about women being consumable goods when it comes to sexuality and men being the consumers, right? He saw what sex is supposed to look like. I don't know what sex ed he got. He grew up in Ohio, which I don't know, but we can only guess, right? That he has not learned affirmative consent, all of that stuff. I want you to contrast that quote from this quote, which is from one of the two men who intervened in the Brock Turner rape case. They saw something and they were like, that doesn't look right at all. And they intervened and they chased him down and pinned him until the cops showed up, right? Yes, applaud for them, they're heroes. What is the difference between the two of them? Swedish, right? They grew up in Sweden where they get comprehensive sex education that talks about pleasure, that talks about affirmative consent, that talks about everybody participating should be having a good time, right? So talking about, I'm not saying like you all have to go and change your curricula so they just talk about dour, horrible things. Like we can do sexual violence prevention work by talking about pleasure, right? By centering pleasure if we connect the dots properly. There is no values-neutral sex ed. If you are a sex educator, what you include and you don't include is sending message about what's important and unimportant, or possibly what exists and doesn't exist, right? I did not learn about the clitoris in sex ed. When we don't teach specifically girls, when we leave the clitoris off the diagram, we're leaving female pleasure out of the conversation, right? We're saying it only matters, the part that the penis goes in and the part that can make a baby, right? Your pleasure, the way that most women get off, is not in the conversation. And when we leave that out of the conversation, we are failing to teach girls to expect their own pleasure. We are failing to teach girls that they should expect that sex is good for them, a positive experience for them. And when we do that, and then it feels bad or violent or painful or abusive in any number of ways, we have failed them. We have abandoned them to that. They don't know that's not normal, right? This is so important. The same thing with queer kids, right? When we leave them out of the conversation, when our sex education only talks about heterosexuality, right? What are we saying? It's shameful, it's bad, we don't want you to exist. And then again, if things go badly and they're being hurt in some way, they don't know. It's not, they already feel like, well, I'm doing something I should feel ashamed of, and it all gets conflated together. It's so, so important. The way to start doing this work is, first of all, like, get real with yourself about, what do I know about sexual violence? What do I feel about sexual violence? What do I think about sexual violence? What have been my experiences with sexual violence, whether myself or other people in my community, people I care about? And how do they influence, like, whether I want to do this work or how I'm going to do this work? Don't make assumptions about who is a rapist and who is a victim, right? This is tough to do, and I'll talk about this in a second, because, of course, statistically speaking, we know that sexual violence is gendered in certain ways, it's aged in certain ways. There are trends that we can talk about. But when you're talking about individuals, those statistics tell you nothing, right? So if you look at our happy clip art people, you cannot know who is a sexual violence survivor and who is a perpetrator and who is maybe both, right? Also, don't assume that they're not both. In terms of dealing with your students, whoever your students are, whoever the people are that you're educating, don't make assumptions based on what you know of their demographics and how they map to the demographics you know about sexual violence, about what their specific experience is, right? I have some struggles with this because I always do, whenever possible, want to call in the room that, like, sexual violence is a gendered phenomenon, right? And those sorts of things, and also say that doesn't mean that, only men rape and only women are rapists. People of all genders can rape, and people of all genders can be raped. And it's messy, right? I still haven't figured out how to do that in a soundbite. I have to just say both things. This is rape apology bingo. I do on occasion play this with students in terms of who's heard these excuses, and we talk about them. So do not, I beseech you, tell anybody how to avoid getting raped. I know, and I give you full faith and credit that if you have done or are doing this, it is from a good place. You want to keep people safe. But here is the thing. What social science tells us is anyone who is going to be deterred because that person over there chose to not get too drunk is just going to go find someone who is drunk, right? You are not, from a public health perspective, reducing sexual violence. You can see all of the advice turned weaponized here. All of those things, everything you can tell someone about how to avoid getting raped becomes a victim-blaming excuse after a rape happens. So this is absolutely the moment that we should be trying to make all of sex ed stronger and better and more comprehensive, more humane and compassionate and pleasure-based. It's on us to make this explicit right now and to say, your pleasure is important, your safety is important. We need to know what we're working toward, what folks can expect and what they deserve. We can be a beacon that people can move toward, and not just sort of what we're against, what we're fighting against. We can't all access our erotic desires equally if we are unequally fearing or experiencing sexual violence, right? If you want a world in which we are all free to access our erotic desires and undermine the established order, you have to see yourself not just as a sex educator, but as an anti-violence educator. You already are, but it's going to become much more powerful when you see yourself that way. You can help us all have better sovereignty over our own bodies. And that, by the way, that sovereignty framework I also got from the beginning of An End of Rape by Sarah Deer. She talks about the concept of sort of emotional and physical sovereignty, and I just love that idea. I think it encapsulates so much. It's on us to ensure that everybody knows that they deserve sovereignty. And then we can get here, right? So you can help with that, and I hope you will. Thank you.